be aware or consider that by keeping children and young people in task focus mode, you could be directly inhibiting their development.
What does it look like in practice? So what was interesting to me when I read your paper and we had a chat, listening to you describe these things and giving me words for what we do.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
Mike Goves, welcome, and Kate McAllister, welcome back to the Rethinking Education podcast.
Thank you very much.
Nice to be here.
Pleasure to be here. Hello again, Kate.
Nice to see you.
So I guess it was nearly a year ago, Mike, when we were at the EdFest at Wellington College, when we sort of agreed to just meet by email, and I hadn't really heard of you before, and you sort of emailed and said, "Oh, do you fancy meeting up?" And then we ended up just like sitting under a tree and chatting for the whole afternoon and didn't go to see any sessions. And there was far more interest in what you had to say than anything else that was going on at that conference. So it's great to finally get this opportunity to have a more in-depth conversation on the podcast. There's so much just juice in this topic of conversation that we're going to address. And Kate is joining for the second or third time. We've wanted to do a return fixture for you, Kate. We did one right at the start when you were just about to start the Hive, which is, goodness, what, 5 years?
5 years ago.
Oh my goodness. Hence all of these grey whiskers. But so let's start with a quick introduction from each of the two of you. For anybody who may not be familiar, let's start with you, Mike. This feel like Cilla Black. What's your name and where'd you come from?
What do you do? And I confirm I'm old enough to have watched that. I'm Mike Goves with an S. Hasten to add the S, not the other person you might have thought of. Yeah, I kind of climbed out from under a rock to say hello to you because I'm fairly quiet on kind of social media and things like this, and just I'm in learning mode nearly all the time. I'm basically obsessed with learning brain cognition, how biology and bodies work. So I've taken that passion really all the way through my life. So I went to study psychology and focused on neuroscience. That was back in 2000, and then went into education and wanted to kind of challenge myself, I guess, and thought if I'm going to do this, I'll do it as comprehensively as I could. So I applied for a role in London in a secondary school, secondary trained science teacher. Was there for a couple of years, super challenging, really interesting, learnt tons. And then an opportunity came up in the independent sector, which at the time sort of didn't really come up as often. So I managed to get that, fortunately, and I became a head of biology and various other roles and director of teaching schools for a bit. And then became a deputy head in a rural state school, state academy. So I went back in the state sector, was there for another few years. And then I took a role nationally with ARC, where I was responsible for the teacher training, curriculum and assessment, and NQTs, as they were called then. As I said, I was always trying to get a big, broad overview to understand the sector as well as possible. And along the way, particularly in the secondary rural school, was involved with alternative provision and free schools, and learnt from that sector as well. And then went back into the independent sector for a little bit, but at a different school completely that used to be focusing on special educational needs. And then now currently in central team in a trust of schools, just over 30 schools in Oxfordshire, and have increasing interests in sort of AI as well as cognition, learning, and particularly affect and affective neuroscience. And so that's where I'm at now, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. So you just mentioned the A word, affect. So for anybody who might know, because it's not entirely in the common parlance, is it? You don't hear that word mentioned on buses and things. So can you just explain a bit about what affect is while we've alighted on it?
Yeah, sure. And I suppose, to be clear, I hadn't either for almost all of my teaching career formally. The whole notion of affect is around your background state of how pleasant something feels in your whole body. So you could think of it as all of the sum total of your emotions and your feelings and all of your reactions that are happening chemically in your body. You can just describe as affect. I describe it as a neuropsychological barometer for it's like a continuous readout of well-being. So that's how it's described. And typically in the literature, we talk about valence, which would be good or bad, and arousal, which would be low or high. And at all times, we're existing somewhere across that dual axis.
Sorry, can you valence and arousal? Talk me through that. What do you mean by valence?
Valence means goodness. So if something rates highly for valence, then it's positive. Something is valuable. It's beneficial to you as a creature, as a living thing. And negative valence would be the opposite of that. So something that's threatening, say in some way, shape, or form, bad. It could also include withdrawnness, depression, boredom as well. So everything that exists across the spectrum from bad for you to good for you would be classed as the valence of something, which is why then that pairs up with is that felt to a small extent, or as in a low arousal level, turn the volume down on that, or really great extent. So, for example, low would be depression, boredom, perhaps, or just barely registering at all. Something's going on in the world and your body's not responding to it. Or let's say, for example, significant stress, anxiety, panic, overwhelm, threat. That would be an example of high arousal and probably slightly negative valence if it was threatening to you.
Yeah, right. Thank you. So we got into the weeds a bit there, but like we're going to get further into them shortly, and it is a very rich conversation, this one. So just briefly, just while we're on this, like, what is it that drew you to this work around affect? Like, why is it that you're doing so much interesting work? Oh, maybe you want to mention the Affective Learning Lab and the white paper. Just
I'll come back to that. I mean, I'm so poor at public communication in the sense of I don't know what to call it really, marketing, that I haven't really even launched that. You're probably one of the 10 people that know about it, but sure, thanks for giving the opportunity, and I will come back to it. I'm going to answer the question first around how I've got onto talking about stuff that no one's ever heard of. So number one probably goes all the way back to my school experience, when there was things I just started to question about, like, what was the point? Like, I would ask questions like, well, why am I learning this? And then sometimes you get sent out. Why are we sure the author intended for this passage in The Tempest to be perceived this way? Maybe they just used alliteration by mistake, and we can't ask them because they're not alive anymore. Again, that was usually sort of perceived as threat, and I'm challenging in a negative way, and often would result in having to stand outside. And so I am interested in curiosity. I think curiosity is really important, and I think we're born that way. And so I didn't like the notion that education might somehow quash that. So that was always on my mind. And I took that forward all the way through, I guess. And in my teaching, I always tried to work with kids who would be a bit like that, I guess. And you were just sort of saying, well, what's the point of this, sir? I love that. Oh, it was brilliant. I was like, yeah, okay. Well, that's a really good question. What is the point of this? And so I started to question the whole system. So why are we teaching the way we're teaching? Why is it that we seem to be treating learning a little bit like information processing? Why is it that we've got this notion of kind of a brain as a computer, that I can give it information and I can just test it and it will retrieve it and then it's in its long-term store? Maybe that's wrong. And so then I started looking around for other alternative research pieces. And just to add on that, like, this is all within the context of when you were doing a PGCE around the sort of 2003, 4, 5 era, Piaget and Vygotsky was super high on the agenda. So it's not as if, there weren't other approaches, but it felt a little bit like, well, we didn't know what to do with that. How do you teach in a way that kind of respects their theory? And that wasn't really answered for me back then. So I started looking around, and I came across a book called How People Learn. And that was written by a chap called Nick Shackleton-Jones. Pretty much changed my life overnight on the education system, education itself, but also, as he concluded, exactly that book right there. Here's my copy.
It's a doozy. We've both got notes sticking out of it.
Yeah, I mean, look, he concluded that the education system in its current form is just horrendous and we shouldn't do it. And he goes on to explain why. but for me, that it challenged me enough to make me question a lot about how I had taught, how I had led teaching and learning, how I was taught to lead teaching and learning. And I felt, I don't want to say ashamed, but I felt guilty, I suppose, for kind of reinforcing a message that I could see wasn't perhaps actually aligned with biology. And so then I started looking at why he thought the things he thought, and he'd taken a lot of his research from affective neuroscience and feeling and emotion, which in the current common parlance sounds like a load of waffly, airy-fairy stuff, and how are you feeling? So if you want to really understand thinking and feeling, and that they're in fact probably exactly the same thing, two sides of the same coin, you need to read that book, because he goes to town on that. But he cites Antonio Damasio as a neuroscientist, and one of his students, Mary Helen Imodino Yang, who you had on this podcast, I think 5 years ago, and she currently leads this work on how we actually function as a human being, including all of our chemical reactions, thinking processes, cognition and learning. And it just became very, very clear that I was wrong. I was wrong in how we could sort of rose and shine our way through everything, and if you test it enough, that it will all come good, and that successive relearning just needs more testing and better explanations, and it just dawned on me, and you would always know this, I suppose, intuitively as a teacher. If kids don't care about what you're teaching, it doesn't really matter how much you smash that hammer onto the desk. It's not important biologically, then it's not going to stick particularly well, and it might for long enough to pass that test, jump through that hoop or whatever, but that shouldn't be the point of school and education. And so I shifted more and more and more towards my role is to help people have a reason to care. If you have a reason to care, we can now through affective neuroscience experiments, mainly through the work of Imodino Yang, show some mechanisms now of how that actually leads to long-term memories, and how that actually, more importantly, leads to human development, literal brain growth, literally happier people who report higher levels of well-being and life satisfaction on longitudinal studies of over 5 years. And so that matters far more to me than I've taught some kids some stuff and they did really well in the test, but they may well forget it in 3 months' time. And so I've shifted entirely towards that's not good enough. And so I'm currently delving into how we might be able to operationalize and understand some of this research.
Yeah, thank you. And so regular listeners and people who are familiar with Kate's work will start to understand why it is that we've decided to
I'm hovering in the corner.
To bring these two amazing people together to sort of to compare notes, as it were, because Kate has sort of been living and breathing this, just sort of largely. I don't want to put words into your mouth, but essentially through sort of intuition more than through like an understanding of effective neuroscience. You've sort of come to this like a way of teaching and learning at the Hive in the Dominican Republic, which is very much aligned with this way of understanding things. And so what I really want to do is to sort of to connect the dots here in this conversation between theory and what it looks like in practice, what it can look like in practice. But we're still on the introductions here. So Kate, if you would please just do a little intro to yourself and to the work that you do, and perhaps to our work and the way that we've been hammering away at this stuff ourselves in our own way for the last sort of 15 or 20 years or so.
So I came across the word affect for the first time when I was temping as a typist in the East Brighton Community Mental Health Hospital. And so that's the first time I heard about it. And the other words that you used, valence and arousal. And I never actually mapped them onto the work I do until I read your paper. So that's 2 plugs. So you have to talk about it now. And I got so excited about, I was like, oh, like I'm barking up the right tree. This is good. This is like, it felt really good. So I started my story is quite similar to yours. I became a teacher after I became a parent. So I wasn't born thinking I would be a teacher. Becoming a teacher was a pragmatic solution to a life situation for me, and it turned out that I loved it. I loved being around young people. I really enjoyed spending time with them and getting to know them. And I taught languages. So really kind of old school grammar, drill, type teaching. That's how I was taught to teach languages. And it's not how I learned languages. I learned my languages by living in the countries where those languages were spoken and making friends with people. And so as much as possible, I wanted to have real world experiences with my students. And that was hard to do inside the system. I managed by hook and by crook. I took them out, did all sorts of different things. But I became quite obsessed with learning quite early on because I concentrated very hard on trying to be a good teacher. And I did all the things that I was taught to do. And some of my students were learning along with me and having a nice time doing it, and others were not. And so I kind of quite quickly, following my curiosity, thought maybe it's not all about me. Maybe some of it's about the student and their experience and what else could be in this experience. They're in a classroom with me, but that's not the whole of their experience. Everything that's coming in from home is affecting their ability to be in a classroom with me, who they're sitting next to, what the weather is doing. All of these things are affecting their ability to be in relationship with me and learn the little thing that I want to teach them that's of very little relevance to a 12-year-old in Brighton. So I kind of went off on this journey of how learning works. And at that point, we were talking about the social and emotional aspects of learning. And I was just noticing that the more relevance there was and the deeper our relationship was, what's the point? The better the learning happened and the more realistic it was. So every time I took them out to school, took them to France, did something, created a cafe in my classroom, like there was a lot of theatrics going on, but it really seemed to make a difference. And so that kind of led me further and further down the path of developing a different model inside mainstream education, where we had the children for almost like a primary model. So in year 7, instead of just going to lots of different teachers, they had one teacher for like 30% of their timetable, but we taught subjects in relationship and connected the dots throughout the subjects. So it was much more of a primary model. And then that led to me working with James at Port Slade when we started our kind of what became the learner effectiveness program, our learning to learn program, which then sort of led me off out of mainstream education and then now off the map a little bit and into my work, what I'm doing now in the Dominican Republic, where I've opened an alternative. I've made my own sand pit to continue my own curiosity. I think, like you said, I have been in learning mode since I went to university, because I left school with no qualifications. One of the only people I know that actually managed to flunk out of school with 0 GCSEs, including math, didn't get maths, didn't get English, didn't get any sciences. I got French and I got art, and then I went off and did other things with my life. So learning mode came to me late in life, and I haven't stopped being in learning mode. So when, through James, I was connected to your work and Mary Helen Imodino Yang's work, it felt really good to know that there was science that mapped onto my intuition and what I had been doing. So I'm very happy to be here today talking to you two.
Yeah, perfectly put. Thank you very much. So Mike, this white paper that you've written, as a way to sort of to get the ball rolling, I suppose, with exploring these ideas. What I'd like to do is I might just read out the first couple of paragraphs, because it's really just does a very good job of getting the ball rolling in this conversation. So the title of it is The Affective Foundations of Human Learning, and then the strapline is Why What We Care About Determines Learning, and How to Build Learning Systems That Work with Biology. And you alluded to the biological realities earlier, and that sort of comes out in this. So if I may, I'm just going to quote your own words back at you, but I think it'll just be a helpful way in.
Remind me.
For listeners. So it says, education and workplace learning continue to face persistent crises. No strangers of these topics to this podcast, including attention, retention, attendance, retention, and disengagement, with performance metrics often divorced from human developmental needs. That's something that I just keep talking about again and again. There is more to human development than learning about subjects, which is just, and then you look at a school timetable, wall-to-wall subject learning. Sorry, I'm elaborating here. So back to this paragraph. Despite decades of cognitive science interventions, learning too often remains brittle, i.e. quickly forgotten, compliance-driven, and disconnected from learners' lived experience and values, which we've already heard in both of your introductions. This crisis persists in part because of a fundamental understanding, and this is really the nub of it. We treat learning as information transfer and brains as knowledge processors. This computational model, dominant in policy, pedagogy, and workplace learning and development, ignores the biological realities of how humans actually learn. So that's paragraph 1. And so we've established there that there's this disconnect. There's all these problems, and you're suggesting that it's because of a fundamental misunderstanding in what we think we're doing here with this whole education thing. We think about it as there's a curriculum, there's a national curriculum. We have lots of debates about the canon and about what texts and what books should be in or out, and Of Mice and Men got taken out a few years ago, so on and so forth. That there's this content. And all of this stuff that we talk about, you mentioned cognitive science there, all of this stuff about knowledge and retrieval practice and testing and cognitive load theory and so on. And it's all about this process of just getting the stuff into the children's long-term memories. And that absolutely is like that set of ideas has really seeped in, especially in the last 10 years or so in England, with lots of support, lots of sort of fanfare, people saying, oh, thank goodness we now have this knowledge-rich curriculum, and we're getting all of this rich knowledge, passing on the best of what has been thought and said into children's heads. And so you're challenging that, right? And you're saying that that's not what this is. So paragraph 2, this paper presents an alternative grounded in affective neuroscience. Affect refers to our felt experience of emotions and bodily states, the internal sense of whether something matters to us. And that's where you were talking about valence and arousal earlier. Drawing on research from, as the people that you've mentioned, Mary Helen Imodino-Yang, her PhD supervisor, Antonio Damasio, who was really the front runner, wasn't he, in this field, Lisa Feldman Barrett, and practitioner frameworks from Nick Shackleton-Jones, who you mentioned earlier, who wrote that amazing book. This paper demonstrates that affect is biologically primary to all learning and memory, and in turn, actions and behavior. And then there's one more little thing, which is just like the takeaway. We learn and remember what we care about, not what we're told. The brain is a biological prediction machine, optimizing for survival and well-being, not storing information. And obviously we care about surviving, and so that's why we're so good at surviving, because that's what we're wired to do. So that sets out the broad strokes of this paper. Do you want to pick that up? Yeah, go on.
Oh, well, just a couple of things on that. So I put cognitive science in inverted commas because it's a big field, actually, learning, memory, and cognition. And we typically, in mainstream education anyways, hear a fairly narrow wedge of what is available out there. So, and I've taught it and I've read it, I have a degree in it, so I understand it. And, there's strong evidence to say it works if your goal is to reproduce on command a particular set of, knowledge or application to usually a pre-designed question. Yeah, so we can control that process. It's quite very far away from actual natural human learning, right? Very far away. It's not. We only invented this process fairly recently, and I guess an example of natural learning might be the sort of natural apprenticeship process that families would have gone through, such that surnames actually gave away what your role was in the community. If you're a Fletcher, that told people what your family did, and over generations you learned, observational learning, you copied, you learned by doing, like Kate was alluding to earlier, and you became proficient. So we're kind of naturally hardwired to do that when it matters, and it mattered in that particular concrete example because that's your family and you care about those people typically. And so caring can essentially be, if you like, shared through, I've called it, well, I think it was Mary Helen originally, called it a caring cascade. So you can pass on cares to one another, because I think sometimes when people read the sentences you've just read out, they think, well, hang on, so that just means people will just do what they want. And there's no point having a curriculum because, they're just interested in what they're already interested in, which of course is ridiculous because we can learn to have new cares all the time. That's what learning is. But it doesn't mean that we're going to automatically care about what the curriculum says. It'd be helpful if we did. I mean, if we could just know stuff by being, read it or being told it, learning would be super easy, wouldn't it? And we must know that that's not the case, because otherwise you could literally just give people the same information and their understandings would all be exactly the same, and everyone would reproduce the same answers in tests or assessments or whatever application, but they don't. But usually the conclusion to why they don't is because the explanation wasn't, somehow good enough. I'm going to also name drop Christian Moore Anderson here, who's also doing a fantastic job of integrating a kind of operational pedagogy for some of this too in his latest book, Teaching Meaning, which is fantastic. Got to get it.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. Go on. Sorry.
Yeah, no, we'll come back to it, I'm sure. In the sense that you can't just give someone meaning, right? You can't tell them it. You can give them an explanation, but their meanings are their own. And so you can use processes of questioning and testing for converging on an agreement, but to diverge towards exploration is what you need through making meaning. And that is dialogue based, it's conversational. And as Christian notes, it will always be subjective because people's cares are different and they're based out of their entire enacted life experience. So there's that. The second thing to say about, just probably the final thing I'll add at this point, is affect is biologically primary to all learning and memory. One thing I realized as both a graduate in psychology, neuroscience, and biology was I really wasn't applying it to teaching and learning very well, because if we're serious about understanding these domains, we should understand where we come from as a species and where we fit into all of life. And if you go all the way back hundreds of millions of years, from even single-celled organisms, you realize that they all, at their very base level, react to something. And there's a reaction to a change in the environment, and they react because of survival. And that has been baked in all the way through every living creature since living creatures evolved. So we have substantive abilities to introspect, to daydream, to reflect, to create an internal model of ourselves, and we call that consciousness. But all the way through, every single function that we do, every thought that we have, is grounded in a feeling of, am I going to survive? What's coming next in my environment that I need to be aware of? And we do it by default. It is how we function. And when we see a difference in the world that we weren't expecting, someone goes, then you pay attention. It's that word attention. I'm sure we'll come back to that, because it might be a threat, it might be negative, it might be positive. It's worth diverting some resources to that, because it might affect our well-being and our survival down the line. That's how we function. That's what we do. And our brain is there to support our body to stay alive, constantly running a model, not of the world, but of itself.
Yeah. This is just so interesting. And so I want to get into the three pillars, right? So there's these three pillars, what you call three biological realities. So we're going to go deep into the science. But first, Kate, I wonder if you have anything to chip in here, like just based on what Mike said. And would you say that captures, in some sense, that intuition that you had, that fundamentally that like the emotions and how we feel about things, and how that we only learn what we care about, not what we're told? How does that tally with your experience, either in mainstream schools or in the Hive?
It matches perfectly from my experience of being in a classroom and almost treating it as a game. It's like, okay, they don't care about conjugating verbs particularly, but that's what we need to be learning to do. So what can we care about that makes conjugating verbs part of the fun? And so you start from that perspective as a teacher, and then you think, actually, I don't even know if I want to do this anymore, because I don't think conjugating verbs is particularly important to everybody. And I ended up, going off on a journey of figuring out what does matter, and what matters, I think, to humanity is mattering. And so understanding who you are and what your place in the world is, and what influence you can have on the world around you. And so I made a note of what you said, learning to have new cares. I think that often a criticism of allowing space for children to learn about what they care about is that, well, they only care about one thing, they're just going to play Roblox all day or whatever. And there's a model of education called unschooling, and that's really what I do now. If I had to label it, I think I would label it as that. And learning to have new cares is what we're doing all day long, every day. And that doesn't happen so much in mainstream schools. It's really rare for that to be allowed to happen, for a child to come in, to be curious, to have something that they really want to talk about. They're really animated about it. It's something they want to make sense of. It matters to them. So they want everybody in the classroom to be talking about it. Like, yeah, not now, later, maybe at playtime. Maybe we'll come back to that. That happens so often that eventually that desire goes away. The desire to share what you're curious about. You're just getting this, you're learning the lesson that what you care about isn't important. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to everybody else around you. And I think that I've always wanted to not do that, to be the kind of educator that doesn't do that to children, that makes sure that there's enough space for the things that they care about and that matter to them to become the important thing that we're learning. So we do go off on a lot of tangents with the way that we do things, and where we start every morning is by checking into our affect. That's what we do. We call it a check-in, and we have a language for describing how we're feeling, whether we're feeling in the attic, towards the attic, which would be high arousal. Now that could be with a positive valence. It could be I feel great today and I'm super excited about something, or it could be an uncomfortable one. And so we spend time in the morning deciding and figuring out, do we need to change the activity that we had planned to meet our affect, or do we need to try and change our affect to meet the activity? Like, which way round are we going to do this? And so we talk about that every day, and we practice doing that every day. So to me, this is, obviously really interesting.
That's going to work as well. There's definitely empirical science behind that. Not that you probably need me to share it, but a quick example. So there's a paper called, I think it was Brain to Brain Synchrony, something, Dicker et al. Double K, which demonstrated that brain waves even will synchronize over time when you're in sharing the same essentially valence and arousals, and you can model it, and people will join and harmonize. And I guess pastoral support workers intuitively do that in knowing how to calm someone down who's in perhaps high arousal, negative valence, anger, threat, disruption, by giving time for adrenaline levels to decrease, cortisol to decrease, to then be able to get their working memory back, have a conversation, name their feeling, talk it through. These things are all biologically supported. I would say there's one of the risks or ways you could misinterpret this is to kind of think it's about fun, and engagement. And let's say, well, conjugating verbs, that's a bit boring. Let's play a game. And that would be an entirely misinterpreted approach to what I'm trying to get across. So for example, you could say, you don't care about, let's go with fractions. I mean, I have it a lot from science and maths. So I'll just go with fractions as an example. I could say, right, well, fractions are important. And then, the kids might be thinking, well, that's what you think. I don't. And so we're going to make a game out of it. Here's some quizzes. Here's some fun. Here's a countdown, 3, 2, 1. There's 3 teams. Who's going to get the high score? Boom, boom, boom. What we've done there is we've focused the emotions. We've focused the affect on the game. And we haven't focused it on the subject matter, the content, the concepts. And that's therefore what's going to be learned. We learn what we care about. That's what we've shown them, what we care about. As opposed to, let's say we set them up with Zeno's paradox problem, which is, for those who aren't familiar, you're tasked with a scenario where you're standing near a door, and you can move half as close to the door in terms of distance over and over and over again. Will you get to the door? And that problem is a paradox because you'll never get there, but it's super frustrating and interesting to people because you think, well, of course I'm going to get there. I'm going towards it. But you half and half and half each time. Research paper, again, out of from Medina Yang's lab, literal kids' testimony to that, saying, I had to learn fractions to solve this paradox. It was impossible to solve it without it. And now I have a reason to care about fractions. I love them now. And I have a concept of infinite, and that means something to my life. So that's where I'm saying we focus the focus of affect on the concepts, the content. And it begs the question then as a teacher, is this, whatever it is you're teaching, important to you? Because you're going to need to demonstrate why it matters at all and to you, and try to channel the emotion, as you said earlier, Kate. It's not about you, but on the subject itself, which then the learner can then really run with, because now it matters to them. And so that's ultimately what we're trying to do here.
Super interesting. And as a former language teacher, Kate, I'm sure you'll recall the sensation that is being experienced by language teachers up and down the country at the moment, which is the summer term of year 9, when they've already chosen that they're not going to do languages. Good luck with teaching those lessons. Like when they might not have particularly cared anyway, but now that it's like they know that this is just like going nowhere, they're not interested in learning in that environment. It's a very, very stark example of a counter example, if you like, of what we're talking about here. Just before we go back to you, Mike, and these 3 pillars, these 3 biological ideas that really challenge the sort of the prevailing mode of thinking around what this whole thing is about. Kate, you mentioned there this word unschooling as a way to describe what it is that you do at the Hive. And I'd just love to hear a bit more about that. I think that people may possibly have heard of deschooling, this sort of process that children often go through if they get taken out of school or if they take themselves out of school. And it's essentially a process of like the school mindset, the school sort of ideas sort of working its way out of your system. And former teachers go through that process as well. I think I might be going through it still to some extent. But unschooling, people might not have come across. So tell us a bit about that.
Okay. So the term's been around for quite a while, and I suppose the easiest way for me to describe it is the difference between a foot that has grown up in a shoe and a foot that has been allowed to be barefooted forever. They behave in different ways. They look different. They are different. They're strong in different places. And so unschooling is a much more natural way of learning. And so the curriculum is not chosen in advance, a long way in advance. The curriculum is what you're doing and what you care about and what matters to you right now. And you have the freedom to learn in the ways that support that. So a common misconception of it is that it's just, there's no relational learning happening, right? That it's all just discovery and play. A lot of it is discovery and play and figuring things out as you go. But it can also be having a tutor, reading a book, watching YouTube, being in a classroom full of other students all learning the same thing at the same time. It's just a free approach to learning the things that you want to learn. So instead of, like, a school curriculum would look like a ladder. You start at the bottom rung, you work your way up, all of the subjects getting higher and higher and higher through the subjects as you go through school. And unschooling looks like a patchwork. It's you do a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of that, and you make a big leap over there to do something that you really care about, and you go deep for a long time into something, maybe achieve mastery in it, and then you go back to the beginning to learn something else from scratch. So it's a much more free, I guess is the easiest way to describe it, free way of learning. But it doesn't mean that there isn't sometimes teaching. It doesn't mean that there isn't sometimes what we would describe as more formal ways of learning. But that's not the only way. It's like the power sits with the learner. And so they can decide what they want to learn and how they want to learn it and who they want to learn it with. And importantly, when they think they've learned enough, which doesn't happen in schools. That's always decided by somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so interesting. The last episode of this podcast, which you probably haven't heard yet, is called We Need to Talk About Power Dynamics in Schools with Dean Nick Citrick. And it was super interesting. I really recommend that you listen to that. It speaks directly to what you were just talking about there. I love the analogy. You're very good, Kate, at just making things really concrete. The bare shoe foot, as you have learned, like in reality, like you've not worn shoes for about the last 5 years. So you've lived that metaphor in your actual life. So let's go back to the science. Let's get into this. So these three big planks, these three pillars. The first one, and I think it's worth saying that there's some vocab to learn here. So we've already talked about valence and arousal and stuff, and like the language of affective neuroscience is by its nature, it's sort of, some of it might sound a bit technical to people coming to this fresh. And so the first one is memory prioritizes affective salience over semantic accuracy. So Mike, could you just unpack these? First of all, let's just unpack these two words, salience and semantic. What does this mean?
Yeah, so I suppose just to frame this as the white paper's language is intended to be relatively academic. That was the aim, but partly for credibility, because I worry that you can talk about things that are not the status quo and people are quick to dismiss them because they don't have a strong evidence base, or there's no randomized control trial, or the EEF haven't approved it or whatever. So I am trying to show that there's a real science here. We're not just making stuff up. Salience just means what matters to you. Yeah. So just think of it like that. If it's salient, it matters. It's a word. It has a meaning beyond just science. Is it salient? Does it matter? And semantic is what something means. So I'm trying to get across that. If you read a passage of text, or you watch a film, or frankly any example where you're reacting to some information of any format, what you will remember will be the bits that caused some form of reaction in you, rather than the exact meaning of the thing you read or you watched verbatim. Simple as that, really. A concrete example would be you're on a train with a buddy, you look out the window for a while, you get off the stop and you go, oh, did you see that? See those doorways? Those arches were incredible. I'm like, no, what are you talking about? But what I did see was some incredible plants that I haven't seen for a while. Did you notice those? No. And ultimately because to one person that's already significant, it's salient, it matters. To another, completely not, irrelevant, didn't even pick it up. And studies of inattentional blindness, if you want to go further into that, we'll pick that up. So that's in a nutshell what I mean by kind of you're more likely to remember what already matters to you, and your body's learned that it should matter to you because it's in some way it's benefited you. It's helped you in your whether it's well-being, whether it's survival. That's ultimately what we're trying to do. So that's that. And then I would just add, because this is all about biology for me as well. Like, why does this even happen? Well, you mentioned vocab, so I'll go back to GCSE science. So homeostasis is a word that should be on the curriculum, and it's taught in the context of maintaining stable water levels or blood sugar levels, temperature, that kind of thing. Ultimately, in order to run a super expensive living creature, don't waste energy. So we have homeostasis built in all the time, right? You don't shiver, which is expensive, when you don't need to, for example. And it's all out of your control, happens anyway. And so in a way, because of that, because that's baked in, we're cognitive misers. We just don't want to invest energy learning everything we could. You're totally bombarded with possible things to react to all the time. So you selectively filter nearly all of it out. And the things that you have reacted to before that have meant something, you keep the reactions stored, and that's it. Everything else is gone. And you use those reactions to be part of your predictions going forward. That's learning. So that's why we're going to prioritize things that matter over, what something is in theory, the whole sum total of it. And we have to do that because it's too expensive. The term that you'd use if you were trying to use energy to deliberately remember something, to behave differently in the future, that's allostasis. And again, we don't really want to do that. So that's where you hear the common parlance of learning's hard, therefore study harder, test, retrieval practice. But the point is, more effort without a reason to care is largely wasted and just makes people annoyed, frustrated, anxious, angry even, and it wastes up a ton of energy that you're never going to get back, that you probably haven't remembered much about it anyway. So don't do that. So that's kind of the first biological reality in a nutshell, right?
So, well, can I come back there? So because that's brilliantly put, by the way. I really like the way that you explain this, and people could probably see why I spent 3 hours sitting under a tree chatting with you. Because
poor guy, sorry.
Right, so I'm going to again read from the paper just because it sort of will consolidate some of what we just talked about. But I think that this gets to the heart of that misconception that you said at the start. So you're right. After that opening sentence, memory prioritizes affective salience over semantic accuracy. So we remember and learn things that matter to us over just like being told what this is important because it means X, Y, or Z. And if you don't care about that, it's gone in one ear and out the other. And teachers listening to this, I imagine, will be nodding and going, "Yes, this is my daily reality." So this paragraph that explains this: the brain does not archive information. So again, all of those diagrams that we see of arrows and little bits of data going into the eye, and like this like long-term memory, as though it's some sort of like storage unit. The brain does not archive information. Memory consolidates what matters for future predicted benefits to well-being and survival, reconstructing experiences from emotionally tagged fragments and current context. Can you just I know that Nick talks a lot about this in his book as well. This idea of like the memory, we don't remember what happens. Memory is a reconstruction process. We sort of reconstruct things when we think that we're remembering them. We're sort of rebuilding them from some. And then you say emotionally tagged fragment. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so there's so there's a more radical answer, which is Nick's, which is that you don't. All we do is remember emotional reactions. You don't store any content ever. You just remember the things that you reacted to, and you reconstruct like where you were, what you were looking at, what you heard, how it felt, and you build that picture up into a reconstructed memory that you can then make sense of and do something with. It's probably accurate biologically, but it's a bit too radical for mainstream normally. But
Yeah, I struggled with that as I was reading Nick's books. I was like, so, but what about when you remember facts? People do remember facts. There are people who remember pi to 10,000 units or whatever, 10,000 digits. Like people can remember information as well as I struggled with that a bit. I can see that
Like,
you're more
I can
likely to
remember
remember things that are
lines.
emotionally charged. But go on, Kate.
yeah, cool.
No, lines from a play that I learned when I was 10 years old or 11 years old in German. I did German for like 1 year at secondary school. I was in a play. I can still remember some of my lines. Now, I must have remembered them, I'm assuming, because not remembering them would have been so humiliating that I would have died on stage. So I committed them to my memory in such a way that I can retrieve them like every time I meet somebody new that speaks German.
Could you
Yeah.
remember where
I've
you
forgotten
were?
out my line.
Could you remember where you were?
In the classroom, yeah. I can remember what it looked like. I can remember which jumper I had on. Everything is locked into that memory.
Yeah.
So something to do with
Yeah.
me not wanting to let them down.
Yeah, exactly. So you had a
down.
reason to remember that, but you are remembering. You're not retrieving, just to be clear. So you're reconstructing various different reactions and sensory experiences, parts of that information, to an overall jigsaw that put you back there. We're very sophisticated at it because we're humans. We've got a fairly big brain, but it's really just an elaboration of what a dog or a sea slug, even frankly, can do. And so the two things I'd add. So the biology of it would be, when there's something that is salient, right, significant, matters, you're going to have the amygdala is going to be activated, right, and you're going to release some noradrenaline, and that also therefore activates the hippocampus, which starts to tag that reaction, that event, that part of that life for you into what we call a memory. And the stronger that is, generally, the more likely that is to be reconstructed. And so you can kind of demonstrate this because McGough did some research where you can essentially directly inhibit the amygdala interaction and turn down the noradrenaline, and you can't remember much at all. So the things that are significant then get tagged, right? We're pretty clear on that from a neuroscientific point of view. But it's picking up all sorts of things because your brain is part of your body. So I appreciate that the focus sometimes can be a bit too much on the brain. We've got this neck up version only about the simple model of learning, right? Well, there's your whole body there, yeah? So you will feel a certain way. And you mentioned maybe it was anxiety, maybe it was important, maybe you've had butterflies in your stomach. All of that information is simultaneously part of that tagging process. That means that when you reconstruct that, it brings you back to there, how you felt, what you were doing, what you've seen around you, what you heard. But it's also unreliable. And Loftus demonstrated that with eyewitness testimony, that people claim that they've seen things that weren't even there. There's a great study called Lost in the Mall where people claimed that they were lost in a mall and that never happened to them. And so it's kind of proof that we don't retrieve, we reconstruct. And we can't reconstruct on information because if it didn't happen, there is no information. We reconstruct on the feeling of what it felt like to be hearing that, and as if it did happen to us. And then that's what we say, was an actual real memory. So,
but then there's also, like Kate was saying, she remembers the lines still, and there is information. There is semantic meaning. There is information. There's data sort of that comes with that emotional package, isn't there? I don't think that it's.
You could call it that, but there's an argument. The counter argument would be the reaction is the sights that you saw, the audio loop that you repeated over and over, and that is all part of the reconstruction process. People don't think of stuff that way. They just say that's information, that's a fact. I'm like, yeah, it's true, but it's no more of a difference to a fact that when my dog barks, I just hear a sound. Was to him, that isn't just a sound. He's trying to convey something. I don't know what it is, but it's information to him. It's not to me. So it's just a bunch of noises and a bunch of sounds, a bunch of feelings, the temperatures and everything that you hear. And that's how we work. And I'll just give one other tiny example, because also I think Christian used it in his book about how biologically it has to be the case that we're not information processing. We make meaning and reconstruct it. If you're facing, whichever direction, and someone splashes a liquid on the back of your knee and then asks you, what's just happened there, people might report, oh, that's wet, or that was water, or a liquid hit my leg. But the thing is, that's not biologically what you're responding to. You're responding to a change in temperature and a change in pressure. And you've reconstructed that. And through prior experience, when you had to have looked and gone, oh, it's a liquid, you've calculated that that was indeed what happened to you. You might be wrong, but that's what's actually happening. We're reconstructing events using all our sensory information and calling it, a memory. And one person's fact is another person's fiction. And that's because of that very reason. That's why it's unreliable.
Yeah. So you mentioned it a couple of times. So just while we're here, you mentioned Christian Moore Anderson. If anyone isn't familiar, Christian Moore hyphen Anderson, biology teacher who's based out in Spain, and he's written this super interesting book. He's written a couple of others before this one called Teaching Meaning: What Works When Telling Isn't Enough, which is a kind of a counterpoint to the just tell them theory. That's advocated by some people in the traditionalist tradition, if we can call it that. I really recommend this book. It is really lucid, and it's just such a sort of a really series of revelations, and he carries it through. It's very practical, and he's talking about teaching meaning, not in some sort of the broad sense, like this is meaningful information, teaching important stuff. He's just talking about what do you think something means? How do you construct meaning? Really recommend that. So go to LinkedIn and look up Christian Moore Anderson. He's self-published this book. It's just come out this week. It's the Kindle edition is now available on Amazon. So go and check that out. So let me just finish off this bit of pillar one, just to really underscore this, because for people coming to this fresh, there's a lot to take in here. So we just talked about these emotionally typed fragments. You say this explains why people can remember intricate details of personally meaningful experiences while struggling with important content that lacks affective salience, as we've just heard about. And everybody who's taught GCSE, and they're like, right, kids, me as a science teacher, we're talking about electrolysis here. You need to be able to predict what's going to happen at the anode. You need to be able to balance the half equations for this. And the kids are just looking at you with that dead-eyed stare that some children have perfected so well. This does not have effective salience for them, and they're not going to remember this information, right? So I think that this is something that is intuitively makes sense, but you're providing, the science.
There is a definite neuroscientific mechanism behind that, and it lies between how the amygdala communicates with the hippocampus, which then communicates with other parts of the cortices, which tags that this matters, worth remembering this particular event we're experiencing. We might need to reconstruct it for later.
Let's move on to pillar 2, which is, I think, where this really starts to take shape and to form a mental model. When we had this conversation about the seesaw a few months ago, it was just oh, whoa, this just makes so much sense of things that I thought that I already understood. And the work that I've been doing with Howell Roberts around botheredness, for example, it all just sort of clicked into place when you talked about this seesaw. So pillar 2, the simple version is, I guess you would call it something like attention is not all you need. Lots of people in CogSci talk about the importance of attention. We can only learn what we attend to, and we need to. Attention is the gateway, and all of that. And then the longer version of this is attention requires coordinated brain network switching, not just sustained focus. So talk us through this attention as a spotlight. Which is the model that's often talked about in schools, that you need to sharpen that spotlight, increase the luminosity of the bulb, get the kids to focus on this, right? This is the thing that's really important. And the more that we can get them to attend to that, the more likely it is that they'll learn stuff. Talk to us about why you feel like this is perhaps a limited metaphor for understanding attention.
Yeah, and also just hold my hands up, been there, done that, advocated for that for years. So, I'm I'm just as guilty as anyone for thinking that is makes sense, and I guess intuitively it does, right? If you've got someone in front of you doodling, looking out the window, playing or falling off their chair, what chance have they got of understanding that electrolysis, like you just said? So, and I don't disagree with that, by the way. Like if someone's crawling all over the floor and they're not listening to anything you're saying, obviously they're not going to magically come up and go, oh yeah, completely understand that. So let me just preface this by saying this is a long-winded title, but if you really want to understand the science behind this, you need to read a paper called, deep breath, Diverse Adolescence Transcendent Thinking Predicts Young Adult Psychosocial Outcomes via Brain Network Development. I say that because that paper actually really matters, and it's incredibly important, but I'm just going to talk about it in everyday speak.
Is that a Mary Helen one?
Well, Rebecca Gottlieb actually is her student actually. So, so the whole attention.
All my favourite words.
So the whole attention thing. First of all, if I say 1, 2, 3, eyes on me, whatever, there's two kind of potential problems with this, and I say potential because it's not to say it's wrong in all cases, right? I need to be in the moment to actually figure this out. First one is you don't know what they're attending to. Yeah, I can look at you, I can be quiet, I can be thinking about the Champions League final. So attention in that sense is just behavioral compliance. So it's a bit like the word engagement. It's a behavioral observation. You don't actually know whether there is attention there. And you can, when people say check for understanding, they're just often just checking for repeating the thing that was just said or something like this. And the second thing is, if there is a kind of genuine attention, you're kind of in task focus mode. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is if you're kept in that for long periods of time. So I just want to preface things by saying this. I mean, I agree with you. This is the model and a metaphor that made the most sense to me about how all learning happens, how thinking happens, how problem solving, creativity happens. This is way beyond just kids in a classroom. This would apply to every facet of your life, in boardroom decision making to kind of learning some science, whatever. So it goes to something a little bit like this. We've got two kind of core modes of being in the sense of behavior linked to brain activation. So there's the task focused, I'm concentrating on this, working memory, goal directed behavior. Okay. And that's when you are really focusing on whatever it is you're focusing on, solving a problem, concentrating. And then when you're not in that mode, you're in a mode which is more about mind wandering, kind of potentially daydreaming, autobiographical memory, self-referencing, thinking about relationships, future possibilities, personal experiences. And you can't be doing both of those things at once. So you can't simultaneously be working on a super difficult, whatever it is, simultaneous equation and reflecting on the wider meaning of maths. So there is a trade-off, and the trade-off is now visible mechanistically when you look at fMRI scans. What we've done with the metaphor is to say, well, think of them as two ends of a seesaw with a plank connecting them. What's the pivot? What is it that tips focus down and reflection up, or reflection down and focus up? It is the salience network. It's what matters to you. And so Gottlieb and Medina Yang have kind of synthesized this for me, working with teenagers. And I'm just going to talk through like kind of what they found in, sort of fairly everyday speak. So pivot is what you care about. If you care about something, it matters to you for some way, or that could be a difference to what you're expecting, kind of coming back to the idea of, I wasn't predicting that. Oh, that's interesting. You are then giving that thing some attention. So in the previous example I gave, if you're playing games, tips and tricks, quizzes, and making something fun, well, that's the thing that you're now focusing on. So we want it to be focused on the content, a concept, something subject focused. And then you're going to give it some goal-directed, focused attention. That is called your executive control network. And it's kind of effortful. That's where people talk about learning's effortful, desirable difficulties, all that kind of thing. But the thing is, what's been found here is if you stay in that task focus mode for long periods of time, you get really tired and it depletes resources, glutamate, if you builds up for those who want to know. And then that starts to just kind of crash your working memory and your ability to keep focusing any longer. It varies between people, right? And so neurodiversity comes in here. You could have hyperfocus for extended periods of time, but that's usually only for something you really care about. You don't hyperfocus on things you don't like. And that means that if you're focused loads, concentrating on this thing, you're not then tipping the seesaw the other way into something that makes sense of what you've been focusing on for who you are as a person, the identity that you have, how it could integrate with that, and the meanings that you make of it. And that's really, really, really important to do, because otherwise what we tend to find is, and what their work showed, was that keeping people in task focus, attention, eyes on me, do this stuff, now do this next thing, now do this next thing, they get tired quickly and they don't remember much about that beyond surface level kind of concrete things for very long. And therefore you kind of get the usual tropes of, oh, I taught you this and now you've forgotten it all, or you knew it last year and it's all gone. It was never going to do anything else, because you need to allow people to then use that information, talk about it, discuss it, just even reflect on it in a different context often, so that you can then integrate it into part of you, and then it becomes something you're becoming. I'm now starting to think like a scientist. This matters to me. And now I feel that when I go about my work in science, I'm thinking, oh yeah, well, I know that problem from here. And I wonder about how I could solve it this way. But I might need some new information. And the pivot of the seesaw is kind of really important there. Is if I force you to do some work and you just don't want to do it and you hated it, you could get it done, but everything is mediated by how much it mattered to you. So your ability to focus on it and your ability to remember it for the long term, integrate it into who you are as a sense of, this makes sense to me as a person and I feel like this matters and I'm thinking this way, is entirely eroded and modulated by how much it matters, that salience network. And the last thing I'd say to it is, the reason why I cared about this study is that they tracked some individuals who are, I think, 14 to 18 years old for 5 years, and came in and got them in an fMRI scanner, talked to them about real stories, asked them to reflect on how they felt about them, what it meant to them. They had to focus on it, and then they had to just stop and daydream and reflect. And they watched what happened in their brain. They listened to what happened in their body. They wrote down what happened through interviews, and they did that for an extended period of time. And those individuals, those teenagers in this case, that thought, were given the opportunity, kind of Kate said earlier, to reflect, to make sense, to just pause on the possible wider implications of what they're learning. That's why they've called that transcendent thinking. I'd call it more abstract, big picture thinking.
Yeah.
Had statistically significant brain growth of grey matter, statistically significant sense of identity being positive. I feel happy with who I am. Statistically significant life satisfaction measures into their early 20s, and well-being measures across, accredited metrics. And it was independent of IQ, it was independent of gender, and it was independent of really any socioeconomic status factor. And they were all from particularly challenging environments. And I think that is absolutely the point for me now. We have an opportunity in schools to teach in a way that allows people to develop themselves as a person, which is now measurable via their brain growth, via their life satisfaction and their well-being and their sense of who they are becoming. And I think that's far more important than, well done, you got an A star, and that's all I know about you.
Yeah.
I think if you asked nearly every adult that works in a school, why are you here? Why does what you do matter? That's what they would describe. That's why they went into the profession in the first place. And yet what we do in schools on a daily basis is moving further away from that, not closer towards it.
I don't, by the way, absolutely no blame for teachers, right? I'm conscious that, we've now got an environment of increased knowledge-rich curriculum. because the epistemology we've got is, if I just explain it well and I tell you to do the task and I do that really well and you do that really well, you're going to learn loads and get good grades. So we can put more in under that basis. And it feels super, and there's far too much of it, right? So you can't possibly kind of get through it all. And when you get through it all, using the seesaw analogy, you don't really have a seesaw. Because if you've got weak, why should I care? Why is this important to me or my friends or the teachers modeling? They don't feel it's important, or wider society or culture. You have very little tipping at all anyway. So the effort they put in is already limited. And then if you also systematically deny them the opportunity to kind of reflect on that, those meanings, how it could apply in a wider world, explore, as Christian puts it, students need room to explore, you're actively inhibiting their development. It's not okay. And you're actively inhibiting their development because you think that, you're told that they can just focus on it and get good outcomes. And then if they get good outcomes, that's their passport to a successful life. Well, guess what? Not really. And like you said, Kate, the whole biology comes into this. And even today, I was on a call earlier with a group I can't name at the moment, who were very aware of all of this and working on a whole child from primary to further education and systematically seeking to resolve sleep poverty, address prior traumas, housing needs, adequate meals, access to resources, opportunities for employment, to see what work could be like whilst they're in school, even up as Key Stage 2, all the way through, not just kind of leaving it to year 10, 11, tick some Gatsby benchmarks, say we've done it, and think about the whole person all the time. These things are biologically important, necessary, and they have to be in place if learning is going to be developmental rather than just instrumental for the purpose of some sort of test.
So, for the benefit of people, again, coming to this new, I just want to do a little recap so we've got these three networks. So you were talking about the executive control network, the thing that allows you to focus on, for example, doing a podcast or cooking an omelette or solving an equation.
Mm-hmm.
Then you've got that reflective network, what's called the default mode network, sort of meditating, ruminating. My default mode network, because I care so much about education reform, I basically just often I'm staring into space. My wife says, "Are you thinking about education?" The answer is usually yes, I am.
That is exactly it, though. So if anyone is listening and you try for an experiment, try not to think about anything. See how long it takes. You will definitely have a thought, right? And that could just be completely random, right? Yeah, it could. But chances are, when you're walking around on a walk with, walking your dog, in a shower, just on a train sat somewhere, ideas spontaneously pop into your head. And it's called the default mode for a reason. When you're not trying to do something, when you aren't having your attention grabbed by something, you are busy doing something, and it's creative and it's problem solving. And actually, the default mode uses more energy, is more metabolically expensive than most. About the same as much, about as much as your thigh muscle in a marathon. So that's what we kind of do, but it's related to, just as you described in your example, the things you most care about, because that's what you default back to.
Yeah, of course. So we've got our two ends of the seesaw, of course, and it's nice because it's like these sort of like one's sort of essentially externally focused, for want of a better phrase. You're focusing on a particular thing. The other one's like more sort of internal rumination. And then the salience network is what gives us the pivot. And that's why, like you just mentioned it very, very, very nicely, that when I'm talking about that, when a kid comes to your lesson and say, "Are we doing something fun today, sir?" And your heart sinks, you sort of go, "Not really." And their little seesaw just takes a little notch down. And then they ask that question that you asked earlier, why are we doing this? Well, because it's on the exam, and their seesaw is basically now flat on the floor. And you might be able to sort of to coerce them and say, right, you need to do this or else.
Or that becomes the object of the affect. So I wanted to get a high grade because, in the sense that Kate was saying, I need to learn these lines because otherwise I'm going to look like an idiot. That's a real thing. Or I'm trying to impress my parents, or I want to make the teacher proud. They're all valid and totally normal. I'm talking about in the sense of a real ideal world. You want everyone to feel passionately about the thing you feel passionately about. Of course, that's never going to happen for everyone, and so sometimes you kind of take and give, and you work with the person who's in front of you. But you're right. The second you hear, "Are we doing X or Y?" or for me, it was, "Are we doing experiment?" I heard that a lot. But when you've got kids who come in and they already know what's happening, then you're on the same page. It's the kids who don't need to ask what they're doing today. It's not about what you're doing. I want you to develop. I don't want you to do.
Yeah. I think it becomes something different when. So I remember being a languages teacher. You say, "Oh, people who can speak multiple languages on average earn 30% more than people who don't." Just statistics like that to try and make it sound more exciting and interesting, and to give a reason for wanting to learn, because it's hard. Learning languages is hard. And then when teachers are saying things like, "If you do this, if you get these grades, you will go on to have a better life," and they know that that's not true. They know that it's not true, but they say it anyway, because there's this sense that you have to funnel them into the machine. They don't want to go into the machine. Everything in their body is saying they want to come out, but you push them through and you tell them it's going to be good for them, but you know it isn't good for them. That's when I think the education system's lost its way. And I feel like it's really lost its way at the moment. I think the people inside it know that that isn't true. Lots of that isn't true. And so that biological thing that you're talking about, being in the presence of someone, of a trusted adult that you can do difficult things alongside, that's gone, because the adult is not to be trusted, and they're asking children to do difficult things. And even if it's not conscious, biologically, I think children feel that. They know that it's not true. It's not right. I'm not doing a difficult thing for a good reason. I'm doing it for something I don't understand. And then I think it becomes impossible to have a positive experience in that dynamic in a classroom.
Yeah, you have to feel psychologically safe. Those are words that I hear a lot, but you need to be biologically living that. And so if you are, if you're pretending, if you're masking, if your cortisol levels are actually really quite high, if you're stressed, just not showing it, you're essentially biologically, you've pretty much collapsed your working memory, right, from the get-go. So the amount that you can, take in at any one time is compromised. Then, I will hear people saying, "Oh, well, then you just need to manage their cognitive load." I'm like, yeah, okay, that's fair enough. I mean, because it's not correct. But cognitive load was probably one of the more respected theories out there from Cogsci land. But it is quite a big variation based on affect, really. There are studies out there that show that the bandwidth of cognitive, how much you can cope with working memory, is greater or lower depending on kind of a sense how much something matters to you, because you're hungry for more or you're not. And if you're not, then it needs to probably be chopped up even more, because you'd rather not, thanks. It's a bit like trying to feed, your young child food when they don't want to. It's like, just this little bit, or this little, I don't really want it at all. Okay. I just think, I get it. And it is, school leaders, they're in a difficult situation because the accountability measures and everything. I understand, I do get it. And I'm not critical of that. I'm just trying to learn. Like I said earlier, I care more about truth than I do about popularity. I'm not interested in being important. I'm interested in understanding, learning. That's the only thing I've ever been interested in. And there's more and more, and it's coming from an affective neuroscience background. But there are other avenues, like in Christian's book, you can go about it from sort of variation theory is a good pedagogical move for making this real in a classroom. I'll come back to that. It converges on the same sorts of things, though, which are biologically accurate. So why don't we just share what is biologically accurate, and then people can do with it what they will? One of them would be storytelling. People talk about storytelling loads. It makes it into nearly every leadership conference. Storytelling is important. Bauer and Clark's research was from 1969, I think. where people had to kind of memorize these lists of words. But when they were told as stories, their reconstruction accuracy went up by sevenfold. So we know stories are really important. And yeah, you go, that's intuitive. So we'll take advantage of that then. Are we allowing kids to talk to one another and dialogue as well, to share meanings? I see a lot of, well, let's turn and talk, which is actually, let's turn and repeat two sentences that you were just told, you just heard from your teacher. So turn and repeat. That's not understanding. That's not tipping that seesaw into default mode to make sense of something, discuss it, explore it. It's literally another version of task focus.
Yeah. So just to wrap up this second one, and there's one more pillar, but the last one, and you just touched upon it actually with storytelling, but we'll spend less time on that because it's quicker. And then I want to get into the practicalities of this around what this looks like in practice in mainstream schools and in an unschooling environment like the Hive. So the last bit of this, so to conclude, you say, without effective significance to trigger network switching. So without some sort of sense of meaning is to decide whether you're going to focus on something or just reflect about it. Executive control has very little to control. Approaches that treat attention as a limited resource to be managed miss the critical role of reflection and consolidation. And again, we'll come back to that. What are the practicalities of this? Is this just about letting the kids just, have 10-minute break, little brain break in the middle of a lesson? Because some people might think, well, that doesn't sound very efficient. That doesn't sound like it's the best use of time. There's also a question here about, there's an argument for. I'll ask this now, but I will come back to it later. There's an argument for having a top-down sort of national curriculum because children might not know that they care about whatever it might be, chemistry or some aspect of the school curriculum, unless it's taught to them. Then their only experience of what they think they care about is what they've experienced so far. And that's what Michael Young did work around, powerful knowledge, right? This idea of, expanding children's worlds and exposing them to knowledge that they might not be exposed to. So there's some interesting questions that spin off from this. But just to close off this three pillars thing for now. The third one is about narratives and identity. And so I'll read a little bit again, and then we'll just explode it out a little bit. Narratives integrate learning into identity. And again, the work that I've been doing with Howell Roberts around botheredness and, presenting the curriculum is like, you've got a person with a place with a problem. If you've got those three things, the kids are going to care about electrolysis now because they understand that they need to help some situation where you need to understand this information to resolve a problem that you've created. They've got an open loop in their heads, and that story drives the learning forward. So you write, the human brain organizes experiences into stories that connect past, present, and imagined futures. Narratives enable the default mode network to simulate possibilities, consolidate learning during rest, and construct the sense of self that determines what information will become personally relevant to who we might go on to become in the future. So this one's about, about the story of the self, essentially. So talk to us a bit more about this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's also an extension of the kind of end of the seesaw of the default mode end. I'm just going to start with that point to say, how this whole seesaw thing, how does it work? I have written a separate guide now since writing this paper on operationalizing this in a classroom environment and in a leadership environment as well, and including individuals who have ADHD, autism, because there are variations on this. But the general principle is it's not kind of just. It's not, you don't want to tip one way and that's it, you're done. So you want to, something should matter. That triggers I'm focused on this now. And then to tip the other way, I'm going to explore what this might mean to me, how I could use it, other perspectives. And then you go back again and you go, well, now look at this. Now focus on this bit. And then you go back again. And it's when we talk about network coordination, that's what I mean. That's what is meant. It's all parts of the seesaw tipping backwards and forwards. There's not going to be no perfect frequency for that. It depends. But the likelihood of all networks connecting to one another is driven by the pivot. That's what the studies show, right? So just to be clear on that. So if it doesn't matter, you might get some focus. You're much less likely to get some reflection, integration of meaning and identity. So then if you are kind of, if something is in some way, shape or form important, or we're just kind of being humans, we talk a lot. And we're narrative creatures. That's what we've done. That's why we have the ability to make sounds out of our mouth. And it so happens that when the default mode's active, it seems to be organizing various different reactions into stories. Into basic, it's not just we've invented the word stories. Damasio would call it a timeline of events. So we're basically just constructing a real life a real time reel of our life. Hence why it's called autobiographical memory. So the default mode's primary function in that sense is, who am I? How am I changing over time based on all the things I've reacted to? And then because we're humans, we can also imagine what that might be, and that is also all being activated in the default mode. So it means that it's a very important part of who we are. It's a very important part of how humans function. And when we talk about kind of learning, ironically, people talk about, let's say, for example, a course versus a chat. You can learn more through a chat because we can share one another's meanings through a conversation and come to either agreement or disagreement. That way, it's often better than just being given the information and make some sense of it, because we're both kind of using our narrative systems to communicate with one another. I mentioned this, the kind of cog-sci research, Bauer and Clark. I think that's the most significant finding out of any cog-sci research. I think a 7-fold increase in accuracy of recall when you have information packaged into story format is really significant. And I suppose that rather than thinking about that study, certainly in education world, people kind of get stuck on the Ebbinghaus story, which is how to learn completely nonsensical trigrams, which don't mean anything to you, which of course you forget really quickly. But then if you're forced to remember them, you'll have to go, okay, I'll focus on this thing again. You can get temporary reconstruction of those things, but it drops off a cliff quite quickly. Well, yeah, no surprise. It's literally irrelevant. So, when we talk about narratives, we're usually talking about some sort of coherent story that we've built in our minds over time. Now we can reconstruct when we need to, but it doesn't necessarily make it accurate, is the only thing I'd say to that. But it matters, and it matters for me in particular with adolescence, because it's a sensitive period of development, adolescence, when young humans are trying to figure out who they are and what their identity is and who they would like to become. And if they've got no time to explore what that might be because they're too busy being told half equations and can't focus on anything else, that's a problem. And so their identity is not going to be linked to much about, a subject matter if they're not given opportunity to explore and to have that kind of default mode activation. So I think that's especially important for adolescence. And by the way, adolescence is defined these days, at least, current best information, as the age of 10 to 24.
Yeah.
So it's an extended
big window
period of time. So yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. There's just so much here. Like, it feels like there's a framework of understanding here, and you really helped to remind me of this work over the last year or so, and to re-engage with it. There's a framework here that's so much of what this podcast has been about over the years. This idea of like education beyond subject learning, or it's not even beyond it. It's education that includes but transcends subject learning, but it's like whole person development. The stuff around botheredness, the stuff like Tim Taylor's stuff around like imaginative inquiry, like there's work like Geraldine Rowe's stuff about collaborative decision making so that the children feel like they matter. The work I've been doing with Tara Ellie around the psychology of mattering. There's so much that just fits into this model. It just makes it all make sense. I feel like we should have a conference and just bring all of the people together so that we can sort of draw together all of these threads within this sort of what feels to me like an increasingly coherent framework for a much more expansive understanding of learning beyond, like, what did Ofsted call it, a change in long-term memory, is just so, like, yes, it's a part of it, but it's like just such a narrow interpretation of what an education is. So let's turn now to the Hive and apply some of this thinking to what happens in the Hive. I'm sure that people would love to hear about where you've got to in your thinking and your practice, Kate, and how these ideas are enacted, largely through intuition, but increasingly through your engagement with this work, through now your knowledge of and understanding of these insights into how people learn. So over to you.
Okay. So what does it look like in practice? So what was interesting to me when I read your paper and we had a chat, listening to you describe these things and giving me words for what we do. So I have a framework that I've put together that I came up with, and it goes round in a cycle. And it does some of this. So it starts with self-awareness, right? So it starts with an awareness of affect. What is impacting on me? Like when you were talking about, a single cell is reacting to something, to light or whatever. We are always in a reactive mode, even if we're not aware of it. So we start with there. We start with an awareness of what's going on inside us and what's going on around us. And then we move to what is that making us want to do? What is the reaction or the response? And what could we do differently? So self-management, is that how we want to respond? Is there another way of doing it? So we focus in on how we're feeling, and then we go back. Is there a different way that I could respond to this? And it works its way round, and then you take the action, and then there's a reflection space. It's like, how do I feel now that I've done something different in my cycle? And what does that mean to me? So we go round this cycle. And so what that looks like in real terms in a day is we check in the morning. Everybody comes in the morning and we sit down and we check in, and we have language. So we learn a language. We talk about the autonomic nervous system. We talk about responses. We talk about dysregulation and regulation, and we come up with words for it. And we have a model that is a house, and it was created by two therapists who were working with young mothers who couldn't bond, who couldn't attach with their babies. And they came up with this description of the autonomic nervous system to describe what happens when you can't co-regulate with your baby, when you cannot soothe your baby. Your baby's dysregulation dysregulates you, and you end up in this negative spiral. And we use that because it works beautifully. So all of the kind of heightened feelings are in the attic, and all of the feelings of being a bit disconnected and switched off are down in the basement. And that sense of being connected online with all of your bandwidth available to you, where you can choose your words and your actions, that's in the living area. So that's where learning can happen. If you are in the attic, you've lost that capacity to learn and form relationships. And if you are in the basement and stuck in what we would, fight, flight are at the top, freeze, faint are at the bottom, that's the very basics of what we do. And so we have this language for talking about how we feel. I feel like I'm in the attic. I'm feeling attic-y. I feel basement-y today. I'm kind of on the floor in the living room, but I'm sliding down through the trapdoor into the basement. Kids get really creative with describing how they feel, and you get a real sense. You can feel what they are feeling through their descriptions really easily. And so that allows me to kind of take the temperature in the collective group. Like, is everybody in the attic? Has everybody got lots of energy, either positive energy that needs to be channeled, or energy that's going to get in the way of us being able to do anything meaningful and purposeful? And then we have space for self-regulation. So we check in to how we're feeling, and then we have an opportunity to either dial that in because it's exactly how we want to be feeling for the job that we want to do next, or we can upregulate or downregulate our nervous system through a series of exercises. So all the obvious ones, breath work, mindfulness, but we also have a punch bag. We have a lot of nature. We can take the dog for a walk. We can turn cartwheels. We can sit and colour in. We can chit chat and play cards together until we get into that synchronized sense where we are all feeling comfortable in our bodies and that our thoughts are manageable and we can get on with what we wanted to do. And so then we kind of toggle into the executive control network. We're doing something, right? We've made a decision about what we're going to do and we're doing the thing. And sometimes we're doing that individually. Sometimes we're doing that as a group. Sometimes we're doing it with an adult who's come in from outside to tell us something they know, but we're focused and we're doing. And then it gets to the end of the day and we're reflecting. And so we have time to write down or to collect or gather our thoughts about what we've done. And so at the end of the day, we have 3 questions at the Hive. One is, what did you do today? So that's where they tell us all the things that they do. That's, oh, I ticked this thing off my list that I said I was going to do, and we're working towards our goal. And then the next question is, and what did you learn through doing that? What did you learn about yourself? What did you learn about other people? And what did you learn about the world? And so that can be really simplistic responses. I learned that actually I can concentrate much better when I don't sit next to Daisy. Or I learned that actually not everybody does things the way that we do them inside our family. And that's really interesting because I thought there was just one way of doing something and it turns out there isn't. And maybe there's an infinite number of ways to do X, Y, Z. And then the last question is sort of, so what? What difference is that going to make? And so that's the salience part of it coming back in. Why does it matter to you? Why is it important that not everybody eats dinner in the way that you eat dinner? Or why is it important that not everybody does whatever the same? Whatever the thing that they've noticed and taken interest in, we can then have a chance. And we either pick that through as a group, or they have a chance to pick at that by themselves. But there is a space that is held open for exactly that process. What did you do today? How did you feel about the things that you did? What did you learn about yourself, other people in the world? And why is that important? What difference is that going to make? What difference is that going to make to the way that you behave, to the way that you treat others? What difference is that going to make to the way that you carry yourself in the world? And so that's how we build our learning cycle. And so we have like a half term, if you like. There's like a chunk of time and we work inside a theme. And so we'll invite people to come in, or we'll watch some things. We'll just get some knowledge coming in, right? We'll bring some interest in. And then one of the first questions is, what did you hear? Right? And so all of the children have had exactly the same experience. They've all experienced the same adult who's come in to talk to them about what they do, right? Whether they're a climate scientist or they milk cows, whatever it is they do. And the children all listen to the same presentation. And then afterwards we say, right, can you just make a note of what you heard? What did you see and what did you hear? Because that tells us what's salient to them, right? What matters? What did you notice inside that presentation? And what questions do you have? And the questions that they have then begin to drive their learning journey. And so sometimes the children will have questions, more questions about the person. They're really interested in the person and how they live their life. Others are really interested in the subject matter that the person was talking about. And they're going to potentially go off in different directions. But all of their learning pathways will meet up again at the end, because we're learning about the big idea. And we're learning it from the perspective of the human beings. We're learning it from the perspective of the subject matter. We're learning it through lots of different lenses, because at the Hive, there are children from all over the world, of different ages, different backgrounds, different religions, different ways of viewing the world, with different lived experiences of that same subject. So we have quite a rich experience. There's lots of ways that it could go, but we have this daily rhythm where we say, right, what did you do on that journey? Did you get to any closer to where you thought you were going to go? Or did you dogleg off on the side and that turned out to be a really good diversion? What did you learn and why does it matter? And we're just constantly going through this little cycle so that when we get to the end, there's big picture learning. It's like, well, I did this, and this. That's the big presentation that they give, right? They show you the thing that they built and they tell you about why they built it and how they built it. And then what did you learn? So then they talk about how they experienced learning about all those things. So I found this bit difficult. I thought I was going to do this, this, and this. Then I changed direction, and why it was important to them, what they learned about themselves and how they've grown, and then what they hope the impact of that learning is going to be on the world and on themselves and on their family and on everybody. And so they can articulate all of that naturally. Like they can tell you the whole rich picture of what they learned and what they did, the skills that they developed, the knowledge that they developed, and why it was important. And so it was really lovely for me to be able to look at our kind of intuitive flow of learning, what I always thought was an intuitive flow. Like there's no point in trying to get children to do something when they're not ready to get doing. They need to get ready to be doing first. And if don't know why they're doing it, if it doesn't matter to them that they're doing it, they're going to stop doing it if you're not prodding them to keep doing it. Well, that's no fun for anybody. And so the whole thing grew because I wanted to create an environment in which children could follow their curiosity, ebb and flow in the natural enthusiasm for what they're doing, learn from the natural ebb and flow of enthusiasm for what they're doing, and figure out how to help themselves if they end up in an ebb that they get stuck in, that suddenly feels sludgy and heavy. It's like, how do you get yourself out of that? And so what you learn from asking a friend to help you, giving yourself small little goals, whatever it is to get yourself out, that maps onto the whole of the rest of your life. So you're learning these really important life skills of how to navigate the world, how to really, really throw the sails up and enjoy when the wind is at your back, right? Really enjoy and go fly. And how do you get yourself out of the heavy sludge when it feels difficult? And you can't really know it in your body in a way that enables you to feel confident to do that when you're all on your own in the world as an adult. I don't think, unless you've had a good go at practicing it through childhood, in a safe environment where there's somebody with you to make sure that you don't actually sail off the edge of the world.
Yeah, my goodness. I mean, that sounds like network coordination in action to me, Mike. I don't know if you want to pick this up. Let's just bring this back to the science. Talk to me about what have you been hearing about what they do in the Hive, and also I'd like to end by bringing this back to sort of mainstream classroom context. So to introduce another seesaw, the Hive is at one end of a seesaw, and people listening to this, I think this sounds amazing, but we can't just let the kids go and walk the dog. Like we've got 2,000 kids in an urban inner city sort of high-rise building, we're working within constraints. And so I want to bring it back to there. But first of all, just share some reflections on what you've just been listening to.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds amazing. I mean, like you say, it's sort of the science supports what you're describing because it's correct. You're talking about how to create states which enable people's biology to be ready to learn anything at all, and that is, mechanistically correct, and incredibly important, because otherwise, if you stay in sort of persistent threat states or high anxiety, not only is that the thing you're learning and becomes the focus of your attention in that way, you're also just fundamentally limited in what you can focus on at any one time and then integrate into the wider you. So yeah, absolutely. The thing you're going to focus on, that's where it gets, I suppose, the crossover. I find it hard to distinguish the two from what you just said there, James, because you're allowing people to explore more independently with more agency, Kate, which is obviously great. And then you can steer that through a trusted relationship and collaboration and dialogue, and be happy that things take different turns and routes organically, and there is a coming back to, a convergence towards a wider goal, but through a different means along the way, which is great. That might come under the guise of project-based learning, for example, which is generally rejected out of hand in an efficient cognitive model. I suppose the middle ground, I mean, perhaps in terms of pragmatism, I'll say two things on this. I'll finish that sentence. Would be to keep it biological. This, I mentioned it a while ago. I think this is where variation theory, I think, matters, because if we do take it as correct that we are essentially biologically predicting what's coming next, that also means that we're more attuned to something that we didn't expect, or a difference. Pedagogically, that's what variation theory is trying to show, right? So if you're interested in something, then the very next thing to do would be show where that exact difference of the thing you're talking about is. Let's say it's natural selection. You wouldn't want to start with, here's a bunch of information about natural selection, I'm going to give you questions on it. Or indeed, here's 15,000 examples and non-examples, and then I'm going to test you on it. You would be, well, here is natural selection, and you pick maybe 4 or 5 examples that show that specific critical aspect of that varying across different species, for example, so that you're really honing in on the thing to notice that's different. I think Christian calls it, if I'm correct, the difference that makes a difference. Because now you're interested in something that's important, and obviously there's an open question as to whether you can kind of encourage every pupil all the time to be interested in that thing. But, that's where subject experts are, actually. That's what they do. And then you're trying to drive at, this is the thing that really is worth our attention, the task-focused element. And then you would find out, then you probably seek agreement. So that's where you would, multiple choice question, for example, check, is this the thing that you think that I'm intending you to just pick up as the different thing? Then you start to explore, though. And then you go back out again. And that would take the form of things like, well, what if this changed? What would happen next? If that happened, that could be an outcome. What do you think? Is that likely, more likely or less likely as an outcome? And then people have to explore. And then you come back to agreement. And then you go back to explore. And that is a way that you can apply that to any formal curriculum, in the sense of, this is a teaching and learning pedagogy that is still grounded in biology. But what Kate's talking about is just another step beyond that, which is what is genuinely the passion of that individual, and how can I shape and nurture that, which is, I'm not giving advice on how we can change the entire education system. But as I said earlier, I don't think that's my role. My role is just, as I see it, understand the biology of how a learning actually happens. And then if it turns out it's not particularly well suited to the mainstream setting, then that's the conclusion, right? And that's where we're at. I think it is important. We can now I feel more strongly about this, because really of Mary Hedden's research and what's happening in Candle, and real life examples from Kate, that it matters to people's well-being, life satisfaction, identity development at a critical and sensitive period of human development. So in that sense, the purpose of school is not learning outcomes. It's development, human development, that aligns with how we would naturally develop. And we're starting to mechanistically see that come out through some of these studies. So, it's an example of that for what Kate's doing. And to just answer your question, the second part again, James, where else does this show up in the mainstream settings? Another example would be where schools have actively gone out to employers and asked them systematically, not what do you want people to know, not what grades do you need them to have, but what tasks and skills and dispositions and behaviours are you looking for in your future employees? And then systematically mapping that and putting it into the curriculum from year, I'd say 5 upwards. I've seen examples of that. And giving the kids opportunities to go explore and come back and feel what that might be like in real life, in a simulated or a structured or a real environment. And if mainstream schools can do that, and I know some are doing that, we can't have that kind of reason of, well, there's too much to teach as a valid reason anymore. And it's going to take some confidence but those that are doing that are seeing great outcomes and happy kids who are starting to see themselves to be becoming somebody that they perhaps didn't think they could become because they've been given opportunities.
Yeah. I mean, James and I, like, how long ago did we start learning to learn? Was that like 2010?
Yeah.
So, like, the first iteration of this was inside a mainstream school. And we just carved out a shape in time where we had a protected space. And we did project-based learning, I suppose, would be the closest description of it to somebody who doesn't really do that much of it. You'd know that would be what you'd recognize it as. And so we had 3 years with students, years 7, 8, and 9. And we did all of this stuff with them. And at the end of that, what was interesting to me and is that there is a salience to passing exams for young people, because that is the currency of everything they understand about how the world works. It's not like there's no part of me that's suggesting that nobody should ever take exams ever again. I mean, if you want to, you should take them. If you don't want to, I don't see why you should need to, but I'm not anti-exams. I think they serve a purpose in the world. The children that we had done this learning to learn curriculum with were better able to pass their exams. Not only was it important to them to pass their exams in the same way that it was, important to everybody else, they were just better equipped to do so because they could trust themselves, because they could articulate their needs, because they could meet their own needs, because they knew how to work together with other people, because they could see the bigger picture, because they'd had time to do philosophical inquiry and talk to one another and have a sense of who they are and what was important to them in the world. Guess what? It turned out that they also got better at doing exams. That's just one thing that you can turn this collection of skills and understandings towards. You can point that towards passing GCSEs or getting A levels. You can also point that towards being a global citizen who understands the big picture of how things work. You can point it towards your own personal health and well-being. You can point it towards your family dynamics. You have this whole set of being a functional human who can tune into themselves and how they're feeling and what they need, and scan out to the world around you and have this kind of biological feedback loop of information and know what to do with it. You can process all of that information because you've been taught how to tune into it. So it's not an either or. I think that's the thing that I want to make sure that I've said out loud. It's not either or. It's not do away with schools so that we can all, live barefoot and follow our interests. I mean, yeah, I'd love to see that for families, because being able to do this also is incredibly enriching for the entire family unit. But I do understand that that's not feasible in the short term, but there's 100 ways that you can use this understanding and implement it into a school day to have a really dramatic impact on both children's well-being, sense of self, brain growth, right? All of those things that we now know science is showing can happen, and passing exams. Those two things they go together. They're not in conflict.
Yeah, they really can. And I think that to go back to your point, Mike, about you see your role here as being to just understand this stuff, and it's like it's up to other people to see whether or not it can work in a mainstream setting. I kind of feel like my salience network is brighting up neon lights, and it's like I think that there's a moral imperative to figure out how we can make schooling more aligned with this more accurate understanding of how people learn. And it goes so far to it's both it contains both the diagnosis and the prescription, this work, especially the work that Mary Helen's been doing, as you say. And I think that, as Kate says, rather than expecting this to be enacted through the lens of subject teaching and for subject teachers to now like figure out how to, you know, have time for reflection and for the default mode activity within their lessons. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. If you do want to do that, I think that Christian Moore Anderson's book is a brilliant place to start. It's absolutely rooted in classroom practice, and it's all about sort of like recognizing the importance of having just a little bit of, and he talks about walking the line. He's like, you don't want to be too rigid, you don't want to be too loose, but you do have to create a space where there is variation around what this thing means, so that people can formulate understandings around that.
It's the closest I've ever seen in terms of a pedagogical translation of the seesaw metaphor, actually. Although, because it's not explicitly mentioned in the book, but essentially it's what it's demonstrating. You know, there's always the open question of salience, because it does vary between people, and sometimes, you know, we'll say, well, you just have to learn it, and sometimes that's also the case, right? Get it. But he's got in that book, it's got 2 rules, 5 moves, and it is essentially how to pivot the seesaw. But like you say, Kate, the person has to want to do it, and it takes effort, and that's the part that's hard. It's not that learning's hard, it's pivoting that seesaw that's hard. It's, I'm going to focus on this, and then I'm going to reflect on it. What's the wider implication of this for me, the community, the wider world, my future? And then I'm going to focus again, and then I'm going to reflect again. That's what's hard. And where we have passions about something, and where experts are experts in anything, they've gone through that process time and time and time again, flipping backwards and forwards. It's effortful, but they want to do it.
Yes. Yeah, and so just to close that loop, like, I think that rather than thinking about this as something that exclusively has to happen within subject teaching, as Kate says, you know, there are models that, you know, we worked on in a school where we developed this over 5 years. We've now helped other schools develop this all over the world, in Wales, in China, in South Africa, in Australia. Recently, we were working with a school to help develop a model where you carve out curriculum time that's separate from subject teaching, where this meaning making work can take place. And it's partly through project-based learning, as Kate says, partly through philosophical inquiry, partly through follow the kids following their interests, and all of the things that we've been talking about. What this work that we now call the Learning Lab. If anybody wants to find out more about that, get in touch. You know where we are. Do either of you have anything to add in by way of closing? And I feel like we could easily have a part 2 of this. There's so much more distance to this conversation to run. I really like the idea of having some kind of a conference where we bring together all of these people whose work just fits into this model. We need a name for it. There's something that's like, I haven't quite formulated this vision in my mind yet, but it feels like there is something really important at the heart of this conversation that has been missing from my own mind, let alone from the school's education, from the wider system, that is just tying together all of these loose threads that I've been, you know, playing around with for years and years. So yes, final reflections from both of you. Who wants to go first?
Kate, do you want to go first?
Well, no. Yes, okay. My final reflections are that I've got lots to read, and I've got lots to read, and I'm really going to enjoy reading it. Academic learning is not natural to me. It will be effortful. I will have to engage my executive control network, but the salience is high, so I'm going to look forward to doing that. And I'd really love to be part of an ongoing conversation about this. I think from my side, I know that there are other intuitive practitioners out there in the world doing this. They are doing all of the things that you are describing in your scientific neuroscience-backed work. And they don't know they're doing it because they don't have a friend like Dr. James Mannion, who's really brainy and explains these things and brings them into the conversation. And I kind of want to just call out to them, all of those intuitive practitioners who are doing this, like, stand up, speak up, join the conversation, because actually the academics who are out there doing the science need to connect with you in order to do their research. To do more research, you need I think we need to bring those two worlds together better, because I feel like they're very separate and they don't need to be.
Agreed. My 2 cents would be, I guess, I just want to help where I can with limited time. And in a sense, I want to help represent the UK's version of Candle, which is where Mary Helen works. And part of that, so I'll say 2 things. Part of that is they're starting, I think they call it an Innovation Lab series, to help give teachers and school leaders practical resources to be able to implement this type of neuroscience. And if anyone's interested in being part of some research we could do on this, get in touch. There is a paper that she's released called Pedagogical Narratives, it starts with, but it's ongoing work and it's happening this summer. So I'm developing something similarly. So be interested to see who would be interested to help be part of that. And my closing point, I guess, might be out of all of this, be aware or consider that by keeping children and young people in task focus mode, you could be directly inhibiting their development.
Yeah. I remember you saying that when we sat under that tree, and it hit me like a hammer. You mentioned earlier that you've written this other guide, the practical applications of this toggling seesaw thing. Is that publicly available?
Not yet. I'm just got it next to me actually, but I'm trying to make sense of it for teachers and leaders. But essentially, I've kind of got 4 elements to it. So when you talk about learning in plain language and the seesaw, make it safe, make it matter, make it stick, and make it yours is kind of the principles behind it.
Oh, nice.
But I'm conscious that make it stick is in itself a book, which is largely computational information processing. So from Brown, so it's difficult to find a language that hasn't already been computationalized and taken over. But I would like to work with others who beyond just kind of me and this small group of wonderful people to help kind of make sense of this for others. So that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I know you've only told 10 people about it so far, but I'll link to the Affective Learning Lab website in the show notes. And there's at the bottom there's 6 universal design principles. How do we translate biology into practice? So you've got start with what people care about, moderate arousal, not too boring, not too scary, not too difficult, not too easy. Alternate between toggle the seesaw and so on. There are 6 things there.
Yeah.
It's light touch so far, and people can access that white paper if they want the heavy science stuff. The white paper is available through that.
Yeah, it's a bit technical, like word of warning, caution, but I've done that deliberately.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And I guess just anecdotally, in big corporates, they intentionally use the education system as a model for how not to do learning and development. And they simplify all this research down, and it could be simplified to the push-pull framework. People will pull from things that matter to them, and that could be through a checklist, a resource, a guide, and some sort of video or a buddy. Or if the organization cares and they don't, it needs to be pushed to them in some way. But you don't do that through a course. You don't do that through telling them what to do, through information giving and explanations. You talk to them. You find out what matters to them. You explore the difference, and then you create experiences and challenges that help drive them that care, so that they want to feel it's important as much as you do. And that model is essentially pioneering, right, and really popular right now in the wider world. So this has implications far beyond just schools.
Yeah, lovely. And there's more about that in that book, in Nick's book. He talks a lot about push-pull. So we all do indeed, as Kate says, have a lot of reading and thinking to do. Thank you both so much for giving so generously of your time. I really appreciate it, and I think that I think this one is to be continued.
Thanks
for your time. Lovely to see you again, James and Kate.
And you.